Hey, welcome back to the Long Lens Podcast. This is the podcast where I answer questions from my YouTube community and just talk about YouTube and filmmaking. Today, we are going to be doing another Q&A since it's the beginning of the month. If you are unfamiliar with the format of this podcast, the bread and butter is mostly a Q&A. So I ask for questions on my YouTube community page and on Patreon, and then I try to answer them to the best of my abilities. So the way that it works is on Patreon, you get your questions answered first, and I give you a little shout out. So let's go to the Patreon questions. We have a few of them this month, and we actually have some good ones in here too. So I actually just got back from running a spontaneous half marathon, so I'm a little gassed, but we're going to get through this. Okay, so the first question is from Andy Mulcaster, and Andy has a few of them on here, but we're going to go through each one by one. The first question is, I've been thinking about being organized and storyboarding/scripting. How much do you script/storyboard your own YouTube content? When working with other clients, how would you plan in advance, etc.? So yeah, I do script some of my videos, but mostly just the ones that are voiceovers. So if I'm doing a voiceover, I'll have a script that I'm reading from because that's typically how voiceovers work. But whenever I'm talking to the camera, I never have a script, never have a teleprompter. I do make bullet points on my phone just using the Notes app, but then I just try to talk to the camera in as natural way as I possibly can. I've never really liked using teleprompters because it just doesn't seem like me. If you ever met me up in a coffee shop and then I was reading off of a teleprompter, I feel like that would be really weird. And I always want, when I film YouTube videos, for it to be like you're just talking to me in real life. So I don't script and storyboard my YouTube videos to that extent where I'm like reading off of a teleprompter for it. But whenever I'm doing a voiceover, I do. And as far as like client work, most of the time I don't storyboard. At least a lot of the client work that I've gotten in the more recent past has been like micro documentary stuff, which you can't really storyboard that well. I can think about how I want to do the lighting and stuff, but I don't typically storyboard those. But when I'm doing like a sponsored YouTube video where I'm going out and I have an intention to make something, those are the ones that I do storyboard, or at least I try to make a mood board of like shots that I want to get, just so I have a little bit of a plan and something to fall back on when I don't know what shot I need to get next. So the next question from Andy is, I'm currently struggling with self-motivation when in a season with little to no external projects. What do you recommend to keep generating ideas to keep yourself sharp and productive? I feel like whenever you're in like that season of not having a lot of work, it definitely makes sense to put a little bit more attention into social media, maybe make some spec ads like I've been doing on my channel recently, and just try to create stuff regardless of whether you're getting paid for it or not. I think that's something that can really help keep you sharp so that when you do start getting work again, you're not super out of it. At least that's my opinion. The next question from Andy is, what would you expect to see in a show reel if you were looking to hire someone? Now, this is something that I feel like a lot of people have differing opinions on. In my personal opinion, if I was going to hire someone, their demo reel wouldn't really be a big factor for my hiring process. I would want to see what they've already done and if they're someone that I like to be around. I have worked with people that have really, really good show reels, but they're really hard to work with. They got a big ego and they're just not fun to work with. So if I was going to hire someone, it would mostly be based off of like their personality, if I liked them, and if they are capable of doing the job, obviously. But most of the time, I would rather have a good attitude person than someone with a bad attitude that's really, really good. A good attitude person who's like still learning is way better than a bad attitude person who has got all the chops. But that's just me. All right, the last question from Andy is Dune Part 2, yay or nay, if you've seen it? I have seen it, and it is a definite yay for me. That is the one movie that I would say, I don't know, I don't go and watch a lot of movies. Like, I'm not a big Marvel fan. I don't go and see movies in the theaters lightly. If I'm going to go into the theaters and watch a movie, it's got to be like a spectacle, right? Like, I went and I saw Avatar for the first time in the theater. You know, I went and saw The Lord of the Rings in theaters. Dune is on that same caliber to me. Dune 2 was amazing. It was a spectacle. It was amazing to look at. The story was great. I mean, it's kind of hard to follow if you don't really know the lore or whatever, which I don't, but I still enjoy Dune so much. It's really inspiring too, as a filmmaker, to go and watch a movie like that, because it's just visually breathtaking. And the really cool thing is that a lot of the shots were shot on like Soviet lenses that you can buy on eBay for like $100. So that's something that I think is pretty cool too. But yeah, I would definitely say if you haven't gone and seen it in theaters, if it's still in theaters, go and see it. I think you'll really enjoy it. Okay, this next question is from Will M. And Will asks, liking the Comica mic you reviewed in the latest video, what is the cheapest mic setup you would recommend for YouTube? The Comica VM30 is really hard to not recommend. I really like that mic. It's wireless, but you can also use it as a wired normal mic. Just put it on top of your camera. You can use it as a USB mic. I featured it in my latest video on my main channel. You can go check that out. That one's really good, but if you just want like a mic to throw on your camera for better audio, like the Rode Video Micro, the Comica VM10, which is the one that I use. They're both basically the exact same thing. If you wanted a wireless solution, again, Comica is a really good brand to look at. I feel like, Comica has been around for, I think, going on 10 years or so now. So it's not like there's some obscure Chinese company that like doesn't know what they're doing. Comica knows what they're doing for the most part. So I would recommend Comica products. The Boom XD Pro system, like their wireless system, the Vimo wireless system, those are all great, especially for content creation. So the last question on Patreon is from Nolan Natasha. And Nolan asks, hey Nigel, after shooting Micro Four Thirds for a long time, I switched to the Sony a7 IV and really missed my lightweight gear and Lumix ergonomics. I'm back with Lumix on the G9 II. I love it, and I'm super happy, but I find myself tempted to pick up a cheap S5 to use with my vintage lenses as a low light full frame companion to my small sensor A-cam. But I sort of feel like it's really just gas, which is gear acquisition syndrome, that makes me want this, and I should just be happy with my Micro Four Thirds setup. Now that you have used the full frame Lumix cameras extensively, do you think that you could go back to shooting Micro Four Thirds full time? What are the things that you love about working with a larger sensor that you'd miss? Do you feel differently about the compromises of each system than you did when you were primarily shooting Micro Four Thirds? Thanks for everything. Huge fan of the channel. That is a really good question, Nolan, and something I totally forgot to do was shout out Nolan in my last podcast episode. I don't know how Nolan's name got missed in my list of Patreon supporters, but Nolan, Natasha, thank you so much for that question. Thank you so much for supporting me on Patreon. And that's a really good question. That's something that I still struggle with too, because obviously I love my S5 IIX. It's the camera that I'm shooting on right now, and it's great. It gives me essentially everything that I need, minus a couple of things which I referenced in this video. There is definitely still part of me, like when I'm on a walk or on a hike, somewhere where I don't want to bring my full frame camera, where I just be like, man, I wish I had a G85 or a GX85 or just something small that I can just sling around on a camera strap just to bring with me so I have something to capture everyday life with. And that's where I really think Micro Four Thirds is going to fit into my workflow in the future. Still love Micro Four Thirds for like one specific reason, and that's the size. The size and the performance of those cameras is still yet to be beat in my mind. Sure, you can get an S5 IIX, which is the same size as like a G9 II, but the G9 II is kind of falling away from the Micro Four Thirds small form factor category in my mind. I feel like they nailed it with cameras like the GH3, the G85, the GH4. Those cameras were just the right size. Even the GH5, which I love, still was just on the bigger side. And it's just like, okay, this is almost getting in full frame territory as far as the size. I wish they would have just tried a little bit harder to keep the body size a little bit smaller. That's why I loved the G85, because it was like, I wish like that's what a GH5 in my mind should have been. It should have been the same size as a GH4, just with all the specs that I want. If you said that like all of my equipment was gone and I had to start from scratch, I probably would go back to Micro Four Thirds. Maybe I would go with like an OM system camera because they have decent autofocus, or I'd go to like a Blackmagic Pocket or something like that, just because there's a lot to be said about the performance to the price of those cameras. Like it's an insane value. But right now I am kind of in a space where I do feel like, even though I love full frame cameras, I still want something small that I can use as a B cam, that I can just throw in a bag and not really think about it. And that camera has to be cheap. It has to give me good enough quality that I can mix in with my S5 IIX. It's gotta be small. Like it's gotta be small enough to where it makes sense to take it over my S5 IIX. So yeah, no, I definitely think that like it can still make sense to have a Micro Four Thirds camera alongside a full frame camera, but like I mentioned in one of my other videos on this channel, I feel like that's kind of the standpoint that a lot of Sony shooters have, is that like you can have an A6700 and use the same glass from your A6700 on an FX30. Or in contrast, if you had like an FX3 and a bunch of glass for your FX3, you could throw it on an A6700. It would just be, you know, the crop of the APS-C sensor. So I envy Sony shooters for that one reason. And obviously you could just get a bunch of EF lenses and put them on speed boosters with micro four thirds and then put them on your full frame camera. But I don't necessarily want to be doing that all the time. I just want to have one lens system for both of my A cam and my B cam. I sympathize with that struggle of like trying to decide like which one to go to. And part of me is just like, maybe I should just switch to Sony. Maybe I should switch to Fujifilm, because there is no guessing and choosing with Fujifilm. All of the main cameras and the lower end cameras use the X mount, unless you're talking about their medium format cameras, which most video shooters don't really use those. So that's something that I think about a lot, and I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do as far as like my everyday walk around camera. I could end up, you know, picking up a G85 again, use that for my B cam, shoot all of my B-roll with it, but also take it out with me when I'm hiking. You definitely can have both systems, but it does get annoying when you start collecting lenses for two different systems. Don't know if that answers your question, Nolan, but I hope that it sheds some light on my perspective on that whole situation. All right, and that is all the questions from Patreon. If you're listening to the audio only version of this podcast, there is a video version on my second channel, which you can find in the show notes below. It is Nigel Barros 2. That's just my name, and then TOO at the end. So now let's go into the YouTube community page questions. Okay, so we're going to do the YouTube community page questions. Aren't a lot of questions this month, but that's okay. These are some good ones. If you could use one word or phrase to describe each camera brand's current state, what would it be? That's a really hard question. One word or phrase. Okay, for Sony, I would say options. That's what you have with Sony. You have a lot of options, a lot of lens options, and a lot of camera options. That would be my one word for Sony. For Fujifilm, it would probably be vibes. Fujifilm, their cameras look cool and their film formulas look really cool. For Lumix, I would probably say value. That's the one word that I would say with Lumix. They pack a lot of features into their cameras, and their cameras always come in under the price of the competition. So value would be what I would say with Lumix. Canon, I would probably say crippled. I don't really have beef with Canon. It just seems like they could put stuff into their cameras, but they just choose not to. And I understand that's because they want to protect their cinema line, but I just feel like they kind of fell behind in the whole prosumer level video cameras. You either have photo cameras like the R6 Mark II that can shoot video, but there's a lot of things that it doesn't have that like Lumix cameras do, for example. Or you have to go up to like a C70 or like a C200 or something like that to get the features that you want. And that's just, I mean, I could buy 3 S5 IIXs for the price of a big Canon cinema camera. For Olympus, probably rugged. Olympus cameras, I think, have the best IP. I forget, like they have the best weather seal rating out of any camera on the market. So Olympus would be rugged. Nikon would be bold because they bought red. They have a lot of really good cameras, and they even put internal RAW on one of their cameras and just kind of like flipped the bird to red when they got sued. And Blackmagic, I would probably say innovation. They innovate a lot with their cameras, but not just their cameras, also their editing software. So maybe that's not the best for Blackmagic. There's probably a better like word or phrase that I could use for them. But I think those are all like the big camera brands that people shoot with. If you shoot with something other than Sony, Fujifilm, Lumix, Canon, Nikon, or Blackmagic, definitely let me know in the comment section below. So the next question is, recently I noticed that you're using a mic on a stand without any cable. Of course, it's wireless. Could you tell us the brand or model it is? Is it a dedicated wireless shotgun mic? Yes, it is. Funny you asked that question because I just released a video that showcases it. It is the Comica VM30. This is actually it right here. This is the receiver. This is the mic itself. It's a great mic. I use it in almost all of my videos now, and it just works. And that's what you want in a microphone for YouTube. All right, next question is, I love Panasonic S line of cameras. I think they are really great and provide a lot for the price. I want to invest in a bunch of lenses, preferably a 14 to 24 2.8, 28 to 70 f2.8, 50 millimeter f1.4, 85 millimeter f1.4. And I also want good photography camera in the L mount system, one with a high megapixel count, hopefully above 24 megapixels for big prints. I was wondering what camera that would be without having to invest in other lenses. I can't really think. I think the S1R has a higher megapixel count than that, and I would use the same S series, L mount lenses that you have or that you want to get. The only other camera that I can think that might have a higher megapixel count than that is like the Leica SL. Let me look it up real quick. Yeah, the Leica SL2 has a 47 megapixel resolution. It looks like it's about $3,000 in the used market, so that's what it's going to set you back. And the S1R has 47 megapixels as well. So the S1R by Lumix could be, because, Lumix and Leica, they're kind of like in partnership. So the Lumix S1R could just be a cheaper version of the Leica SL2. So that could be an option for you if you're looking for a high megapixel L mount camera. All right, and the last question for this month's Q&A podcast is, I noticed wobble on the 28 to 70 when walking handheld on every focal length. It's not a camera problem because I see it on the S1H and the S5 II. I am not the only one with this issue. Did you experience it? I mean, I've experienced wobble at like 28 millimeters, but I don't typically walk handheld and do stuff at anything tighter than like 28 or 35. So I can't really say if it happens at, 50 to 70, but I definitely notice wobble in every wide angle lens that I use on my S5 IIX. So I definitely do think that it could be an IBIS situation because some cameras' IBIS systems work differently than others. And, wider angle lenses are going to have wobble because of the IBIS. So I'm not sure if it's specific to the 28 to 70 because I've noticed that on my Lumix lenses as well. The Lumix lenses might handle it a little bit better than the Sigma because they were, designed by Lumix, but I still think that it's more than likely a sensor stabilization issue. You're claiming it's not, which maybe I'm totally wrong, and the 28 to 70 does wobble at 28 millimeters, but it hasn't enough for me to notice and, get upset with it. So yeah, I would say, if you're experiencing a lot of wobble at 28 millimeters, maybe just shut off image stabilization or choose a different lens. That's kind of a cop-out answer, say choosing a different lens. But in my personal experience, I haven't experienced a lot of noticeable wobble in the 28 millimeter focal length. When I shoot with like a 14 millimeter cinema lens, I see wobble on a 14 millimeter cinema lens because it's so wide. And that's just what happens when you're using an internal image stabilization system. And I saw the same thing with like the Olympus EM1 Mark II at 12 millimeters. You see a lot of wobble at 12 millimeters. So I'm not really sure if that answers your question, but in my experience, I haven't seen wobble that's been bad enough for me to really notice. Anyways, those are all the questions for April 2024. I'm going to see if I can get another guest on this podcast and do another interview. I always like doing those because I feel like I learn a lot. And thank you so much for listening to the Long Lens Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. This is where I'll be posting all the video versions of this podcast. And follow me on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Leave me a rating. If you leave me a rating and a nice review, I might even read it on the podcast. Anyways, thanks again for listening. I'll catch y'all next time. Later.